I have prepared actually a talk here, but I won't do it. I'm going to largely improvise now, and I'll do so because there's no point in telling you all that what the IMF are and that the IMF are bad. I think that we all know them. We are a bit tight with time, and that would be wasting half an hour, 20 minutes, 15 minutes of your time to tell you what you all know. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the experience we have in Latin America with the IMF. And I'll say why, because a lot of people, you know, when the IMF was marching into town, were going, oh, sure. And I always tell this story because it's interesting. And I think it's very telling of how isolated or in a state of mental isolationism that we've been in Ireland for at least the Celtic Tiger years. That people go, oh, sure, the IMF are coming, now what's going to happen? Like if it was a big mystery, like if there wasn't a consistent experience of 30, 40 years of IMF involvement in ruining entire countries and starving to death entire populations, okay? So I always go and say, well, I actually know what happened because I come from Latin America, and the involvement of the IMF in Latin America was actually very early. It started in the 40s, okay, from the very inception of the IMF, okay? But it largely had a very kind of, we should say, low-profile role for a number of years until the 70s. Okay, and for all the talk of free markets in the mouth of let's say the directors of the IMF took hold in Latin America in the most oppressive circumstances. Forget about free markets. We're talking about dictatorships. Most of Latin America. Okay, in the case of Chile, my country, we had General Pinochet. What these people did was get heavy loans for whatever projects they had or for whatever purposes, enhancing the army, enhancing national defense, and so on and so forth. And they got in heavy debt with the Paris Club, with the World Bank, with different institutions. Then what they didn't see is that by the 70s they were applying something that was floating rates of interest. Okay, that was the deal that most of the Latin American dictatorships got. Okay, so what did floating rates of interest meant? It meant that the interest rate would be adjusted over time. Okay, so you assume certain, let's say, 5%, and then it could go up to 7 or 8% according to economic fluctuations. It won't go into the whole process. It wasn't random, but no matter, nonetheless, what it meant is that by 1998, Chile was still owing 8 times what they had originally requested for. Okay, so we're talking about 20, 30 years later. Now, coming back to what happened is that at that time then, in the 80s, in 1982 in particular, the crisis exploded. A lot of banks collapsed, pretty much the same here, so I won't go into details. It's not qualitatively different, it's actually pretty much the same. And the IMF walked into town, walked into Chile, walked into Argentina, walked into Bolivia, walked into everywhere, and they said, we have all the right answers for you to make your economy solvent on the one hand, but on the other hand, for you to be able to pay the result of it was a huge economic crisis, because they applied 2 types of economic programs. One were stabilization programs, and the other one were structural adjustment programs. Both were extraordinarily invasive of the country economic decisions. Both were done, as you may expect, solely in interest of the ruling classes, and particularly of the creditors. Now, you have to remember as well, the 80s, most of the countries are still under dictatorships. So that means that a democratic debate around the debt, a democratic debate around the crisis and who's paying it, like we can have in Ireland, we should be pushing in Ireland, and we are pushing with disparate initiatives. I'm coming back to that later on, was out of question. Okay? At the time of Pinochet, you agreed or you disagreed, or we didn't care really about your opinions. So the environment for them to operate was, in one way or another, far more easy for them. They applied all of their theories with free hand, so they couldn't blame the people if the theories failed. If the IMF prescriptions failed, it was because they were fundamentally flawed. It wasn't because there were resistance or they couldn't implement the program fully. They had open doors to do whatever they wanted. Now, some of the results were the devaluation of currencies that led to higher prices, and that led to a chronic stagflation, that economic process that mixes stagnation with inflation. Then the liberalization of investment led to tough capitals. That means that as soon as it was more profitable to go to Bangladesh or wherever, you know, boom, the jobs were going and left nothing behind, absolutely nothing. So all the code of foreign investment, that it's a very relevant discussion for Ireland, particularly in relation to corporate tax, as if foreign investment was the ultimate solution and the unique or a particularly uniquely privileged path towards welfare should be brought to question. Then the economies were all readjusted to get rid of the import substitution industry, and we were all led into this export-led development that meant that there was a real deterioration in terms of trade, particularly in areas of the economy that were crucial, such as copper, oil, and so on. And so with the liberalization of the trade, all we were left with was with a comparative advantage in terms of wages. So a massive process of depression of wages started, this race to the bottom as we call it, because we had to be competitive. Okay, and it's again a similar discourse to what you hear in Ireland. Okay, we have to be competitive, but that doesn't have any end. I mean, because it's always going to be someone more desperate than you, and of course, this was done in a prolonged period of time, and for a long while people actually believed, yeah, we need to be competitive. I'm sure you could see that investment was coming. There were new factories, and every year you were getting less and less. But anyway, people saw it. Now, the problem was when the situation became actually unbearable. And that's the first principle I want to talk about. And is that a lot of people, when the IMF walked into town, came up saying, sure, it's that the Irish really don't know how to fight, you know, we're never going to fight, we're never going to stand up. Look, in Latin America, they faced the IMF, they fought and they won. And in Ireland, what we're doing? We're doing absolutely nothing. Well, what I want to say is that the biggest triumphs against the IMF in Latin America were fully 20, 30 years after the IMF walked into town. So I want to bring down a bit the mythology of the Latin American people as being somehow more aware, somehow more conscious, and having stood up and fought straight away because that didn't happen. I think that we have to be facing, and we have to be very clear on that, that's going to be a protracted struggle, okay? And excuse my English, not my first language, so sometimes I get difficult to say words like protracted, but I can get a bit, my tongue can get a bit twisted. So, anyway, it is a protracted struggle, and that means that we have to deal with perseverance over time, merging forces wherever we can, trying to build a common understanding, and fighting one that I think it's the biggest enemy of revolutionaries worldwide, that it's pessimism. And from that point of view, I want to quote Gramsci, when Gramsci said that you had to be, I don't know how it's the translation in English, I will translate from my Spanish, okay? That you have to be a pessimistic of the intellect and an optimistic of the heart. Pessimistic of the intellect, because we know that we're facing a very complex struggle, we know it's very difficult, and we know it's going to be tough. Okay? When the whole IMF program and all that falls, it's not going to be, and collapse, it's not going to be nice. December 2001 in Argentina was not nice, it was desperate. Okay? It was terrible. The people saw that they were losing everything they ever had. Okay? But we have to have that pessimism in mind, but at the same time we keep the optimism in heart, because we know that change is unavoidable. And we know at the same time that we are not passive creatures on earth whose only aim and objective and mission in life is to evade dictates of the rich and the powerful. We know time and again by studying insurrections and revolutions all over history that it's actually that largely marginalized, illiterate, peasant, worker community that makes the difference. At the end of the day, we know that we are political actors and we can't change things. How much time do I have? I'm trying okay. So what I want to say is that the big demonstrations against the IMF started when, I mean, just to give you a view of what I'm talking about, in April 1984 in the Dominican Republic, you had overnight, that means you went to bed on Tuesday, and Wednesday you woke up to see all drugs, all medicine was up at 200%, that rice cooking oil were up 100%, and the result was people on the street, big protests, 112 civilians dead. Okay, that's just one example. There was far more than that. The Caracazo, February 1989, Venezuela, as well, same thing. Perez tries to pass a number of neoliberal measures, the cost of lives go up, the currency devaluates, And in the end, you had over 1,000 deaths. No one really knows up to the present, because usually the poor are counted not by names, but they're counted by lumps, okay? So we can say that it was over 1,000 people, but no one knows really how many people died. Now, that's the background when the people started fighting. The people started fighting actually when they had nothing else to lose. It's not because they said we don't like the IMF, it was because the first reaction, you lose your job, the first reaction was, okay, I'll find another job. You couldn't feed your family, your first reaction was, okay, I'll get something to feed them. Okay? People only fought when they had nothing else to do. But we have an advantage now, is that we know this history, and we don't need to wait to hit the bottom. Okay? So persevering, it took time. We need to get into an economic debate as well. And I want to be very clear on this. I don't believe in technocratism, whether it's right-wing or left-wing. Ultimately, the debate is not economical. But because we have to be clear of the complexities that we're facing, we have to get involved as well in understanding and stripping of its aura of infallibility, the ideology of the ruling class. Get to know their concepts, get to know how they speak, get to know how they translate into our everyday experiences, and look for alternatives. And let's think of the alternatives. Now, that will not change the balance, because you can have very good arguments, and if you don't win the population out there, you will never make that a viable alternative, no matter how beautiful it looks in the paper. Now, the way to win them is always a very strong, long, tactic perseverance work in which you make the political argument. And the political argument, I'm very glad to see this, there's going to be next Thursday, 12th of May, a demonstration in Kildare Street for debt repudiation. You know, repudiation is far more powerful term than default and whatever, because it means that it's not our debt. It shouldn't be imposed on us. I mean, and that's the bottom line, and that's what we really have to convey to people. This is not about saving the economy. This is about saving a few speculators. And Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, in 2002 was talking about the Brazilian model of dealing with the crisis and the IMF bailout. I'm going to read it because I think it's very instructive. You could say he's talking about Ireland still. Okay? He said the IMF and the Brazilian government spent some $50 billion maintaining the exchange rate at an overvalued level in late 1998. And where did the money go? Money doesn't disappear into thin air. It goes into somebody's pocket. Much of it into the pockets of the speculators. In a sense, it is the IMF that keeps the speculators in business. I don't need to say anything else. I think it's really well put there. So I'm coming back again to the politics of this. The disruption of the IMF and the structural adjustment programs in the economy of Latin America was so severe that all of the mechanisms of traditional representation of society were completely dislocated. And I'm talking from left-wing parties to right-wing parties. All of them were dislocated. And you saw the emergence of the new social movements in the 90s, okay, that actually allowed a number of sectors that until then had not existed. I'm talking about indigenous, I'm talking about coca growers, people that's living basically in the legal economy, okay, that usually would have been lumped traditionally with what we call the lumpen proletariat. But they were allowed to come to the fore, take a leading role in the struggle, and find new ways as well, new mechanisms of representation, of making their voices heard. And I want to say, because the traditional structures of representation of the working class and of the left by the mid-90s become largely irrelevant on the one hand, but on the other hand they were becoming an obstacle to allow the struggle to go ahead. It is significant that no big anti-neoliberal struggle was ever taken by any big trade union structure in Latin America. And I do believe that's not going to be the case in Ireland, at least with the domination, and I'm going to be very honest on this, with the domination of labour over the trade union apparatus. Now, it doesn't mean that the workers were absent. It doesn't mean, indeed, that trade unions were absent. But it meant that all of those mechanisms had to be readjusted, that the working class had to reinvent itself in a way. And not only that, but at the same time that new methods of organization were found. The piqueteros in Argentina, in Bolivia you had different committees. For instance, when you see the struggle against water charges, it was all led by trade unions, indeed by the most traditional trade union of all, the industrial workers. But they found a space to join marriage users, and they call it the Committee for Defense of Life and Water. Okay? And I'm about to finish now. Sixth, that will have to start, this is very relevant if I'm in a Republican meeting, it's very relevant to fight against the neocolonial prejudice. time and again, you talk with your neighbours, you talk with people, you know, when the IMF was coming, and everyone was saying, Jesus Christ, no, it's good time, good riddance, we get rid of all these gone bean fuckers, don't know what they're doing, excuse the girls, my language, but just don't say it at home. It's good that we're getting rid of all these gone bean people, and we are bringing serious guys from Germany and Britain, they really know what they're doing. The question is, historically, we know they don't. Well, actually, they do. But what they want to do is not what we want them to do. Now, it's important because this neocolonial prejudice means that it's stuck, it's rooted, and ultimately it means that no matter you have a tattoo of the tricolour in your arm, still you believe that Irish people are ultimately incapable of running their own affairs. And it's only the Irish people, and particularly the working class, that have to prove that this is not right. In Latin America we had exactly the same. Okay? The people that spoke English were the people that knew, and we were just the people that spoke languages that were considered dialects or that weren't even proper languages. So what can we say about all this? But again, it was them that made the difference, and Latin America has moved to a great extent. It's moved very far away from the dark years in the 90s of the absolute neoliberal hegemony. And the people who have moved them were not people with university degrees, were not experts on economy, were not professional political analysts, were actually ordinary people, people that in most cases didn't know how to read and write. So I come back to this. Politics should stop being the privilege of the few, and really it's about reinventing the language we speak on politics. And again, it's very relevant for Republicans, because when we're talking about fighting the neo-colonial project and the neo-colonial ideology and the neo-colonial mentality, it means as well, what type of Ireland do we want? And again, we look today, and we have sectors of republicanism in the north cooperating with the cuts, while they're denouncing them in the south. So it is kind of stuff that we need to kind of look into. We need to look as well that for many years the dominant argument was, oh sure, now the north will eventually merge with the south because the south is now the Celtic tiger, we are in a better off society. When it's not, the unity of Ireland is not about, and I want to bring James Connolly here again, it's not about having a better off or a lesser off form of capitalism. And from that point, division, you can say, partition, as Connolly said, it was a carnival of reaction on both sides, because the capitalist ideology really got entrenched on people. It is about doing something qualitatively different. Yes, my English is not my first language, so apologies. It's about doing something qualitatively different. So when we talk about the Irish unity, we really have to bring that into mind. What type of Ireland we're talking about? Because if it's the Republic of Ireland sitting in Leinster House, I'm afraid we're not going to be convincing many of our fellow Irish people in the north about becoming a nation once again, as the songs say. Now, the last thing I want to say is that there is an importance in the pressure from below at all points. Even when you got what we call national developmentists, nacionaldesarrollistas in Spanish, national developmentist leaderships that actively opposed the dealings with the IMF, they did so as long as the working class was in the streets, the people at large were in the streets, pressuring to do so. Good example, Argentina. Everyone is talking about Argentina defaulting in 2001. Sure, they couldn't do anything else. And it will come the time when Ireland will have to default, because this is unsustainable in the long term. By the most conservative economic analysis, the economy is not going to grow, we're not going to be able to fulfill our commitments, and the economy will eventually collapse. We all know it, okay? Now, last year, November last year, Kirchner, the president of Argentina, she rearranged starting paying the debt with the Club of Paris again. It took 10 years, but eventually they came to terms and decided, sure, we want to be good capitalists, we want to be good partners, so we'll repay that illegitimate debt, largely assumed by dictatorships and then by the most corrupt, clientelistic politician you can think of, Mr. Menem back in the 90s, okay? And they're assuming, and they're accepting to pay that again. Why? Because the pressure of the people are not there anymore. So we can say how long and how lasting political change will be in the long term in Latin America? We don't know. It's still an open process. But what's sure is that whatever we've moved from the dark times of neoliberalism has been by the people of the struggle, of ordinary people on the streets, Gorg Magat.